Yo, what's good with you? Back in black with another Enlisted video. If you guys are new to the channel and you love shooting games just like me, make sure you aim for that like button and shoot that subscribe button as well. It'll help you find better teammates and improve your skill-based matchmaking. At least I hope so. In this video, we're going to be comparing all the BR3 rifles for the Western Axis faction and Enlisted to see which of them is the best for you in your particular playstyle. Coming up first, we'll be taking a look at the VG-15, which is the People's Rifle or the Volkssturm rifle. This weapon was designed in late 1944 with the same late war desperation speed that the Volkssturm militia itself was formed with, and perhaps that is something you can tell aesthetically since the weapon looks like an amalgamation of other German guns attached to a metal tube. The description also notes that this was an attempt to arm the German militia with a cheap and reliable rifle, but from what I read during my lore research, it was actually quite inaccurate in testing, which will be a point that will come back later in the stats. But getting into the numbers, we're getting a maximum damage of 8, which is going to be lowest in the tier, and out to 100 meters that'll actually go down to 6.2, which is very significant for both of those numbers, because that means in most situations, unless you get a headshot, it's going to take 2 to 4 bullets to down someone, depending on whether you're hitting them center mass or hitting the limbs on top of how far they are. Essentially, this weapon is somewhat of a hit marker machine, so do your best to aim for the head or the chest. And although it is a rifle, I don't think it's too far-fetched to recommend a medium to medium close playstyle with this weapon. The reason medium range is still feasible mostly comes down to the bullet velocity, which is also lowest in the tier but comes in at a base stat of 680 meters per second. So if you have good aim, generally speaking, the velocity will indeed allow you to play back further with this weapon or stretch your engagement slightly further than your typical submachine gun. Rate of fire is actually going to be tied for highest in the tier at 320 rounds per minute, which is right in line with the BR2 Armaguerra. So if you're used to spamming that or like the ability to spam generally speaking, you'll be happy to know that this rifle also has a nifty 30 round magazine courtesy of the STG-44, so feel free to blast away. An equally comparable benefit we're getting thanks to the box mag is going to be a best in tier reload speed at 2.7 seconds, and keep in mind that's an empty reload, so if you alternate reload before you shoot down to your last bullet, it will be a smidge faster, which makes all the difference, especially when somebody is trying to kill you. To my dismay, and alluding to what I was saying back in the beginning about the bad accuracy from my research, the shot deviation is worst in the tier by far, coming in at 55, and when you couple that alongside the low damage, it really is one of those things that makes you have to close the distance to see maximum effectiveness with this rifle. Something that's nice to see on this rush project of a weapon is a boosted recoil control percentage at 70%, which is rare and typically something you would only see on submachine guns, so it'll be super easy to stay on and switch from target to target, which may be a bit overkill since the recoil was already best in the tier, coming in at a vertical stat of 46 and a horizontal stat of 20. Generally speaking, the recoil is essentially non-existent when the weapon is used in the appropriate ranges. Speaking of appropriate ranges again, I feel that the iron sights on the VG-15 are okay at best, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that the weapon performs optimally at closer ranges anyways compared to most German rifles, but I find that the sights are very bulky and blocky, and that's not to say that you can't land some long range shots with this thing, but the sights aren't necessarily doing you any favors the further a target gets from you. Ironic statement to make for a rifle, but also plays into the lore and makeshift nature of the weapon and the desperation that Germany probably had at the time. Coming up for contestant number 2, we shall now take a look at Germany's first successful semi-automatic rifle, the BR3 or G41 for short. Germany had been experimenting with semi-autos since 1901 but didn't actually quote-unquote believe in them until they saw the Red Army deploy the SVT-40s in large numbers. Quite the misstep on their part, but hindsight is always 20/20, and the same thing could be said about the STG-44. Looking at the stats, we're getting a maximum damage of 12, which easily clears the highest in the tier, and out to 100 meters that'll go down to 9.8 per shot. So it would be a safe bet to assume that unlike the VG15, majority of your targets will be downed in one hit, provided you can engage them within 90 meters and hit center mass. Bullet velocity is also going to be highest in the tier at 750 meters per second, so with those two things in mind, closing the distance on your enemy won't be as imperative with this gun, but rather it will pay dividends to prioritize patience and accuracy on this rifle, since it'll usually take one shot to down somebody anyways. Rate of fire, like I said earlier, is tied at 320 rounds per minute, but with the G41 in particular, that isn't necessarily something I would be vying to take advantage of more often than not in comparison to the VG15, unless somebody happens to pop around the corner when you're in a building, or come face to face when you're like in a trench or something of that nature. My reasoning is mostly due to the fact that by comparison you get a much worse 10 round magazine as opposed to the 30 round magazine on our previous competitor, and what's worse than that is that the reload time has also suffered a considerable downgrade, moving down to a tier worse 4.8 seconds. To speak on reloading a little bit more, I'm not too sure if that was a balancing decision to keep the weapon from being too obvious of a choice, or maybe they wanted more of a significant trade-off between the G41 and the VG1, but the G41 does indeed have a box magazine at the bottom, and I guess apparently it's just one of those situations where instead of removing the box magazine and putting a new one in, the soldier decides to insert 5-round stripper clips instead, much in the same vein as the Lee Enfield, and that does kind of suck. But anyways, the shot deviation is best in the tier, coming in at a stat of 28, so that will make follow-up shots at range way easier to hit in quick succession in comparison to the VG1. Recoil, on the other hand, for the BR41 is kinda crazy on paper, and unfortunately, unlike our previous competitor, we don't get the bonus of having a recoil control percentage bonus. So yeah, like I said, the vertical recoil on the G41 is coming in at 100, and a horizontal stat is coming in at 35, which is worse than the tier by far. I'll be the first to say that it's not as bad as it may seem on paper as it is in practice, but I would definitely recommend treating this weapon like the opposite archetype of the VG15, where again you kind of want to prioritize pacing your shots, and it definitely wouldn't hurt to invest in some recoil control perks for your soldier as well. Aside from that, the iron sights on the G41 or the BR41 are pretty bad. Not extremely bad, but definitely below average. The reason I say this is because the bulkiness of the rear sight makes it very hard to line up targets very quickly, particularly at long range, and it sucks to say that because I know this rifle is more so acclimated to long range play, but very often I will find myself missing like 1 or 2 or sometimes even a good portion of my 10 shots before I have to reload, and that's a very bad feeling, knowing exactly how long the reload will take, especially if I'm not doing an empty reload. Oh, and I didn't even mention it before, but I would not recommend doing a reload when the enemy is nearby unless you already shot exactly 5 bullets to get that convenient one stripper clip in there, or if again you so happen to shoot down to 0 bullets, but at that point sometimes you will find yourself wasting ammo. So it is one of those inconvenient things where you have to make sure you're making all your shots count. If you find yourself entering singular bullets in the middle of a gunfight, I would just try to get 1 or 2 in there and then cancel the reload, because if you don't, I'm sure the enemy will cancel the reload for you, if you know what I mean. But before I get into my conclusion, I did want to include a bonus segment mentioning both the Kar 98 with the anti-personal and the anti-vehicle grenade launchers. Not that I would necessarily include them in my ranking, but what I did want to say about the anti-infantry version is that for anyone unaware, AP rifle grenades have received a significant nerf to their blast radius and their damage due to the spammable nature of the weapon and how annoying it can be for somebody on the receiving end of that deal, especially when you have an entire squad equipped, with somebody rocking grenade launchers. It kind of brings back flashbacks of one-man army noob tubes in Call of Duty. If you know, you know. But with that being said, I think it was a justified nerf, but unfortunately with that nerf, it kind of makes rifle grenades, at least the anti-personal ones, kind of obsolete. The anti-vehicle Kar 98K, on the other hand, that one actually does have a lot of utility, and I guess what I would say about that, generally speaking, is that the trade-off of running into BR3 or BR4 matches with a bolt action rifle is kind of justified when you can kind of swap to something to quickly take out vehicles, especially if you are running around in those squads that happen to not have an anti-tank person in them. So that's pretty much my 2 cents on that. But yeah, man, overall, or in summation, the VG15 and the Gewehr 41 seem to be in stark contrast to each other as far as what niche they want to occupy when it comes to being a rifle. On one hand, you got the VG that kind of acts like a discount long-range submachine gun that can only be fired in semi-automatic. The standout feature for a lot of people is going to be the very plentiful magazine and convenient reload speed, but weapons like this that have a lot of bullets with low damage and relatively low accuracy for a quote-unquote rifle can only be as good as your trigger finger allows. Not only that, you are forced to have proficient map knowledge, as you are forced in the close distance more often than not, and the only time you will get to see those one hit downs is if you happen to get a headshot. So that is something to keep in mind for those enemies that will usually have a gun that either shoots faster or hits harder more often than not, I guess in the time that it'll take you to get those 2 to 3 shots in, which basically makes positioning, like I said earlier, paramount to get proficient use out of this weapon. The G41, on the other hand, would be the easy recommendation for those players who would like a rifle that is more of an assured one-hitter quitter, at least substantially more often than the VG, so that makes the decision easy alone for a lot of people, I would imagine. But I would be remiss not to perpetually mention that generally speaking, the iron sights on the G41 are slightly harder to work with, and reloading is always going to take a lot longer on the G41 as well, so you really got to make your shots count with this gun. On top of that, we have no recoil control percentage bonus like we do with the VG, so if you suck at controlling recoil, or you like sights that are more clear and open, generally speaking, that would be something to consider. Me personally speaking, if you ask me to choose one rifle to put on all my BR3 German riflemen and Italian riflemen, I would probably go with the G41 due to the simple fact that you can get a lot more one-hit kills, and I value that over having 30 bullets in the magazine and having to take 2 to 3 of them to kill one person. I would also argue that as long as you make your shots count with the 10 bullets you have in the G41, that should be able to get you through most situations. And we do have perks in the game to mitigate reload speed and recoil. Unfortunately, we don't have any perks in the game that give you more damage, and even if you fully upgrade the VG15, that damage will never go over 10. So I feel very comfortable putting the G41 in first place as my go-to BR3 rifle, with a few anti-tank Kar 98 sprinkled in there for good measure. But what do you guys think? At the end of the day, these are just my personal opinions. I am hoping with the combination of my gameplay and my explanations, you can decide for yourself which rifle would be best for you to spend your silver on and upgrade over and over again for your BR3 German and Italian riflemen. If you made it this far, let me know. I do appreciate you guys very much for watching, and I am curious to know which out of these 2 rifles is your favorite. Type that down in the comment section and tell me why. I do appreciate you guys very much for watching. Don't forget to aim for that like button, shoot that subscribe button as well. Help you find better teammates, improve your skill-based matchmaking. And yeah, I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Black Guy out.